Let me invite you to go ahead and open up your Bibles to Psalm 146 that we read just a moment ago. Psalm 146. We'll begin our lesson there in just a moment. It is good to be visiting with you this morning. And glad to be back with the group here. We had a wonderful trip, and good to meet so many of the brethren out that way. I do appreciate Andrew preaching last week. And I did listen to the recording before that, as well as last week's. I was thinking as you were introducing that, Bobby Graham told me one time when he asked me to preach a second time, I said, well, I guess I did a good enough job the first time. He said, well, either that or we're giving you another chance. But I had good confidence and it was rewarded, I think. There's a lot going on in our society, and you might have heard that there's an election this week. I don't know if you knew that or not. But there's a lot of stirred up emotion, a lot of people talking about that. The choice the people make this year may decide whether we have prosperity or depression, war or peace. This is, my friends, the most important election in your lifetime, and we cannot afford to lose it. It's Harry S. Truman on behalf of Adlai Stevenson when he was running against Dwight Eisenhower. They did lose it. And 4 years later, Harry Truman showed up again and said that was the most important election in a century. I guess he forgot what he said 4 years previous. John F. Kennedy said his election against Richard Nixon was the most important since Abraham Lincoln. And then Nixon said his was the most important. And then Ford, and then Reagan. Dukakis said such against Bush. Clinton said as much. John Kerry said as much against Bush II about their own elections. But it's not just the politicians themselves. Pundits get in on the action. It would indeed be no exaggeration to say that this will be the most important election that Americans have ever known. That's the Atlantic magazine in 1868 about Grant versus Horatio Seymour. The Atlantic magazine in 2012 published an article saying it's time to do away with the phrase that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Had a whole article about how it's overused and it doesn't mean anything anymore. Then this year, the Atlantic magazine started out an article this way. How often have you heard politicians say this is the most important election of our lifetimes? Well, this time it's true. Sure. I don't mean that this election has no consequences. I don't mean that it's not significant, that it won't play a significant role in outcomes that may even be beyond our understanding. I will say this. One man will not determine the rise and fall of this or any other country. It never has. And if somehow down the road you're able to look back and say, yes, there were some consequences there that led to declines in certain areas in our country, that doesn't mean you're right. It means you're a broken clock probably, right twice a day. But maybe, not only would we point to that, but we'd point to other elements all along the way. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of the last emperor who came to the throne. It fell for a series and generations of declines and sins that led to the crumbling of that empire. Incidentally, as we just sang, led to the crumbling of that empire in the face of a certain kingdom that stayed established. And so I want to think about those things this morning. What I want to think about is that there are high stakes in this election. But the stakes are not about who is pronounced the victor. That's not the most important thing, at least for us, certainly. That more important things are at stake. In fact, this election has eternal consequences. But not for America. It has eternal consequences for Christians. And the eternal consequences, again, will not be based on who wins the election, but rather how we conduct ourselves during the election. And so I just want to think through a few simple concepts to keep in mind over the next several days, and really in every aspect and every moment of our lives, but in times of stressful communication and where everybody's trying to convince us that this is the moment that all of history hinges on. We want to keep in mind that all of history hinges on an event on the first day of the week a little over 2,000 years ago, not this Tuesday. And so I want to focus our attention in that direction. With that in mind, just three elements for us to keep in mind this week. And the first is that what we want to do is honor God. No matter how we talk and what we do this week, that everything that we do, we want to think in terms of making sure that we honor God. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, we do that by putting all of our trust in Him. Psalm 146 lays this out so well. It says in verse 3, "Do not trust in princes and mortal man, in whom there is no salvation," or hope, as Noah's translation said. I like that even better. There is no hope in princes who are going to return to the earth in the very dust that they came from. And they and all of their grand ideas and their plans are going to go with them. No, instead, how blessed is the one whose hope is in the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God, who really has power. And so as we draw near to the election, and maybe some of you have already voted, and maybe some of you already decided not to vote, but with that in mind, whatever our language is about that, it needs to be language that maintains and keeps in mind that this is not where my hope is. Then I think some of the hyperbolic language that everybody uses, the superlative language that we read, this is the moment. Christians should not be talking like this. You know, we ought to keep in mind that, hey, look, things may get a little better, things may get a little worse, but whatever happens, I'm not tied to that. I'm not tied to the rising and falling prosperity or the rising and falling stability of our country. And no matter who you elect, they will not fix all the problems. And there are a lot of problems. And they've always been there. And I suggest to you, they always will be. They may get better from time to time. And good leaders do help that. And I'm not throwing that out. But don't talk like somebody's going to fix it other than God. And that's what he says here. Don't trust in the princes. Even if a good one comes along, he'll only be here for a little while. And so the messianic language even that gets tied in. I think we've seen that with our last two presidents. That people get up to here talking about, oh, this is the moment in history. It's not. It's not. At the very best, it'll be a little better. If you're right, it'll be a little bit better for 4, maybe 8 years. Or, at the very least, you'll imagine it is because it's your guy. But the truth is, princes, they all fail. They all fail and fall short of the perfection that God offers us. And in comparison to him, truly. Well, back in 1 Samuel chapter 8, I think gives us a good bad example of what we should not be thinking. Here in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and of course, their situation is such that the Lord is more directly leading this nation than he is ours. And his government is not the government that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 13, that he's established as an intermediary to sort of, in general terms, represent justice and so forth, but rather God himself is at the helm. And in spite of God himself being at the helm, you know, in 1 Samuel chapter 8 what happens, but that the people begin to look around and they say in verse 5, "Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations." When we start talking about political leaders like the rest of the world talks about political leaders, with the hope and the confidence that the rest of the world talks about these things, we've lost sight of who our God is and what he's capable of. Along those lines, I want to keep in mind that God will have more impact on what happens in the world this week than I will. No matter what I decide to do this week, it will not make a huge difference in world affairs or even in this nation's affairs, or just frankly, let me say, even in our city's affairs. I know that people will say every vote counts. And then some people will actually debate that. Maybe every vote doesn't count. But regardless, even if everything goes as smoothly as it can possibly go, what does my vote count? And I see people saying all the time, well, I live in this state, and I already know where this state's headed, and I live in this state, and I already know where that one's headed. And you have people just pleading and speaking to your importance. Every individual is important in this effort. And what I realize, and what I need to understand is that, first of all, just statistically speaking, in mathematical terms, it really does not make as much a difference as I'm sort of educated to think. But more than that, even if I had, the power to really sway elections in one direction or another, at best, what am I accomplishing? Right? Even if I did have great power. But then compare that to God, who sits in the place of power and might that he does. And he says things like in Daniel chapter 2, we sang the song just a moment ago from verse 44, but backing up to verse 21, Daniel says of the Lord, it is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. It is he who knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. He is revealing to Nebuchadnezzar a force more powerful by inconceivable exponential fashion than Nebuchadnezzar can even think of. Nebuchadnezzar assumes he's the most powerful force in the world. We've come to think of American presidents like that. The leader of the free world is the title that we give to the president. And really, many people in the world acknowledge that. It just is the reality. We live in one of the most powerful countries in the world, and so whoever's leading this country is in that position. And yet, what Daniel wants to present is, by comparison, you're a puppet. You just don't have that much power. That's what Jesus says to Pilate, isn't it? Do you not know who you're talking to? And it's almost as if Jesus is saying, I think it's you who don't know who you're talking to. You don't have any power except that it comes from my Father. So whatever you do this week, take it with the grain of sand, of salt that it is. You're going out there and you're participating in a very, very small way. Much more powerful is what you do when you get home, when you speak to the one who's truly in charge, who truly holds all of this in his hands, and with a word can shift world powers. His vote means all. So I pray to him. And frankly, he knows better what to do with his vote than I do with mine. And so I rely and I lean on him more and more and have more confidence in his will. Well, when you are deciding what to do, as we honor God, what we want to make sure is that we're taking his motivations with us everywhere we go. We want his thoughts to be our thoughts, his ways to be our ways. Back in Isaiah chapter 55, that language should sound familiar. Isaiah chapter 55 and in verse 8, the condemnation is that my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. I want my thoughts of God, my understanding of his will to inform everything that I do. Christians cannot dwell with the sort of accepted reality of a separation of church and state. Now, I'm for that terminology from the standpoint of trying to keep government and churches separated. I don't want government running the churches, etc. But my Christianity, my devotion to God must be at the heart of everything that I do, including voting or not voting. And so don't take your Bible with you into the ballot box, people will say. No, absolutely. Take it with you into the ballot box. And let this be the thing that informs us. When we think about issues, there are going to be issues that are plainly laid out, that we have to recognize the hard realities of what God has to say. And we cannot yield on that for political advantage of whatever that might bring. And I want to suggest to you that thinking God's thoughts means that you may say, I'm going to vote in a manner that honors God, or not vote in a manner that honors God. I'm going to do this in a way that I'm thinking biblical thoughts when I do this. And what that may mean is that you could do the very same action in a godly way and in an ungodly way. I think we can go and vote for someone out of anger and spite, or we could go and vote for someone saying, this is, from what I read in Scripture, the closest option to what God wants. I want what He wants. And I want to develop that notion in my mind. That is the idea of wisdom. Is the more we read and the more we take on of God's Word, the more we are capable of making decisions in the path and in the pattern of thoughtfulness, thoughts, and ways that God has laid out before us. And I say that this is the condemnation. I've said it before. God is not saying you can't possibly think like I think. What He's saying is you really ought to, but you don't. You should. You see, He says there in verse 7, let the wicked forsake his way. That's what He's saying. Not your way, but my way. Let the unrighteous man his thoughts. Forsake your ways and your thoughts. Think my thoughts and go my ways. Along these lines, I want to be very careful not to misrepresent God. When we start talking about politics, I think sometimes we get very confident about what God would say. Certainly the denominational world's kind of picked up this phrase, what would Jesus do? Put out bracelets and T-shirts and so forth. And then that gets attached. And I've seen articles. What kind of car would Jesus drive? What kind of health care would Jesus vote for? And et cetera. And all sorts of these political issues. And they try to figure out a way to stamp that on there. What I know is that very often, if we come to Jesus with a political question, He will send us all away disappointed. That's what happens in Matthew 22. Let's ask Jesus about taxes. And what does He say? He said, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Incidentally, that's not a pro-Caesar message. And it's not an anti-Caesar message. It is, you have more important things to worry about. Pay your taxes and get busy serving the one whose image you bear. You're worried about what to do with your money. I'm worried, what are you doing with you? Who has your heart? Where are you most devoted? And that is a big problem leading up to contentious elections, is that people in a defensive manner, they kind of work themselves up and they're looking for more and more sort of justification for their position, to the point where God is on my side. Be careful. Maybe He's not so solidly on your side as you think, especially if our attitudes become the very attitudes of the carnal world that we supposedly are fighting against. And along those lines, then, we want to not misrepresent God's character. In Romans chapter 2, and in verse 24, Paul, as he's calling the Jews to recognize their own failures before God. He's telling them that they are the ones who have broken the law and dishonored God. In verse 24, it says, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, just as it is written. We are in a contentious election cycle. I don't think it's the most contentious election cycle in history. I do think it is more contentious than some. And certainly the language is very hostile in both directions. And in my efforts to sort of present maybe biblical thoughts and biblical notions, I have to be careful that I don't just fall into the same patterns of back and forth that the world has engaged in. Like, this is the only way we can talk to each other now. Meanwhile, non-Christians are looking on and saying, yeah, just like the rest of us. Or maybe they even take a self-righteous position and say, you're worse than the rest of the world. Whatever the case, our communication needs to reflect the one that we serve. We don't want to misrepresent him, not in words, not in character. I'll tell you one thing that is frustrating. You might have had this happen to you before. Have you ever had somebody come and like through one party after another, it gets back around to you and somebody says, now, when you preach, this happens maybe more frequently. Somebody says, now, why do you believe this? I've had people come up to me and say, why do you believe this? And I think, believe what? Well, now, somebody told me that you believe this. And I'm like, how did they get that notion? And occasionally I've been able to trace it back. And it's because of something I said in the sermon, and then they put that together and they draw certain conclusions and say, well, so he must think this. Well, I don't think that. And it's really frustrating. And I wonder then, how many other people have you told that Stephen believes this or teaches this? Not because of something I actually said, but because of conclusions drawn. We want to be careful about that with God. That we pick out some single passage, some verse plucked out of context, and we hold that up and say, here, God would behave like me. And maybe even in the same context sometimes are verses that say, no, he would not. So, I want to honor God. I want to honor my brother this week. This is particularly difficult when we are in the midst of disagreement. I think that is at least somewhat the context of Romans chapter 12. He intermingles our relationships with our brethren, and then that kind of like melds into relationships with enemies. And unfortunately, sometimes those overlap. But he says in Romans chapter 12 and in verse 10, be devoted to one another, he says. Devoted to one another in brotherly love, give preference to one another in honor. It is not hard to have that honor and give that preference when we think all the same things. Like, that gets real easy and real comfortable. You know, this week we were with Leonard's brother and his wife. We were there a lot because we weren't eating out with other people. So we were in their house the whole time. We spent a lot of time together. And we got along wonderfully. And our politics were pretty much in the same vein. And we didn't have much in the way of disagreement. In fact, so very often there would be another subject. Yes, we're on the same page. And so you have that Amy and I were just talking about how comfortable and how easy it was of a week as far as the visiting. There's sometimes, though, it gets to be hard work. Because things get said, and now I've got to be much more careful in my communication because we're not on the same page. We believe the same things about certain fundamental principles, but then about decisions to accomplish those principles, we're maybe not on the same page. And I've got to work, maybe, to be devoted to brotherly love and to show honor and preference to my brother. In order to do that, I want us to be clear about what we agree on. In arguing about directions that you could go in this or any election, there's really, I think, 2 or 3 main areas where the sort of arguing comes from. Abortion would be a main one. And I think many of us would feel that if nothing else, that alone makes our sort of mindset clear as to what direction we're headed. Homosexuality or maybe sexual immorality in general and the promotion of that would be another. And then maybe care for the poor and the oppressed would be another. And the notion is that one party is completely correct on the issues and the other party is completely incorrect. Or maybe we divide it up and say one party's got these 2 down, but they're totally off on this one. Maybe the other one's got this one down, but they're totally off on this one. And we could debate that. But my concern is the notion that because someone maybe looks and says, all right, I think I'm going to vote for this guy because I think that he'll be the most effective at addressing these. He won't fix it, he won't clear it up, but he'll make it better than it is, or maybe keep it from getting worse. Right? That's generally our mindset as we approach that. Then somebody says, oh, so you don't care about little kids. That's most politicians, right? The other guy doesn't care about little kids. That is such a low insult. I don't know many Christians that I've come in contact with who are even shaky on what they believe about abortion. What I think they may be shaky on, as far as our disagreements, is what's the best route to addressing that problem? And how do we reduce the number of abortions? And you may think, why is that even a conversation? But it is. But I want to start from the premise of we really agree on what the Bible says about that issue. And so the disagreement is not really what the Bible addresses, but what it doesn't address, which is which one of these 2 wicked men is going to do less harm in that area. And people make arguments that you might not think exist, but I've talked to people who believe that a different direction than what I think actually could make some progress there. I don't agree with that. But I agree with them that abortion is a problem. And we both think that. Coming the other way, brethren who look over here say, your guy would grind the poor into the dirt. I said, first of all, it's not my guy, please. But secondly, I don't agree. I care about the poor. I care about injustice, and I care about oppression. And I would like to have that conversation, but the assumption is if you're going this way, you don't care about this issue. If you're going this way, then you don't care about this issue. And what I find is generally the case, we actually care the same about those things. We just do not agree about how to address those things. Those are very different questions. And maybe that might help us if we start with the agreement. I'll just give you a non-political example. In talking about the covering, which is a thing that there's disagreement even among us on. I was talking with a brother who I'm in agreement about the covering on. He said, there's just a lot of women who just don't care about authority. It's just not true. That's not fair. We agree on authority. What we don't agree is how to express or show that authority in conjunction with 1 Corinthians 11. But let's not go attack the foundations of what we believe. You see, we're hopping from the foundation over here to an application of the foundation and say, because we don't agree on that, well, then we must not agree on the foundation. It's not true. So we need to, I think, maybe shore up and be more clear about what we believe about the foundations when we are in disagreement. We also need to be very careful not to decide what everyone ought to do where God has not given plainly expressed will. I am going to vote this Tuesday. Some of the people that I have the highest regard for, people I consider mentors of mine, are not going to this week. And we've made our cases to each other. I hope kindly. I know they were kind to me. I hope I was to them. We've made our cases to each other. And I think that they made some valid points. I think I made some valid points. But they're going to go and do their best to honor God in what they're going to do, and I'm going to do my best to go honor God in what I'm going to do. And I think that sometimes more than one valid case can be made. In Acts chapter 15 and verse 37, is the story there of Paul and Barnabas and John Mark, and what to do with John Mark. And Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them also. But Paul kept insisting that they should not take him alone, who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and left, being committed to the brethren, to the grace of the Lord. Who's right? I think they both have valid points. I think John Mark does need some encouragement. He probably needs a wake-up call too. There are some commentators that'll go through and they'll try to figure it out. Like some commentators will go, look, John Mark came around. Guess Paul was right. And then ironically, some of the commentators go, look, John Mark came around, looking at Timothy. John Mark came around. Guess Paul was wrong. But maybe not. Maybe they both had valid ways of addressing the same issue. Or in our case, maybe we have limited knowledge and capacity. And while we understand what the issue is, and personally in our own lives, we go about doing what's clear that we ought to do. When we start talking about influencing others in our small little vote, the one little thing that we're going to do there, we feel a little bit less confident in what the absolute right thing is to do. And maybe we should display a little bit less confidence, overconfidence towards one another. You see, because what's at stake on the ballot is not the foundations of our relationship. What's at stake in the ballot is, at best, bad choices and trying to figure out which is the least bad. Or a little bit of good, and we want to figure out which one's got the most little bit of good, if you want to frame it in a positive way. In Ephesians chapter 4, and in verse 3, verse 1 beginning. Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. That diligence to preserve the unity, the humility and gentleness, the patience and the tolerance for one another. We're not tolerating, we're not talking about, well, I'm not tolerating abortion, neither is the other guy. I'm not tolerating oppression, neither is the other guy. I'm talking about tolerating that person. The person who believes the same things you do and who worships God in the same way you do. He's the one I'm showing patience and tolerance for. And I'm working hard to maintain the unity of the Spirit. Whatever you've decided to do this week, if doing that causes you to look at the guy who's not doing that with disdain, then you will lose this election. You see, I want to end this week with more regard for my brethren than I started it. And that may take some hard work this week. I really want that to be the case every week. Most especially, I want to be thinking those thoughts this week so that I don't say, I've staked out the correct position and all these rubes around me. No. I care more about maintaining unity there than any sort of unity in a political realm. Well, finally then, we need to honor the king. It is what he is due. I'm always struck by the way that Peter phrases this in 1 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 7. Let's see here. Verse 17. In 1 Peter 2 and verse 17, honor all people, he says. Love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. What I'm struck by is the different word he uses for each grouping here. So honor everyone. Like everybody deserves like a baseline level. Your brethren, let's go a step further. Love the brethren. God, give him reverence. You don't fear anyone like you fear God. He alone deserves that. And then we come to the king, honor the king. It's almost like we're back down to the baseline level. At the very least, you give him honor. Honor that is due to his office. Honor that is due to him as an image bearer of God. And so we need to think about that with our speech. I am sure that whatever happens on Tuesday, the news outlets will be filled with grace and mercy as they speak of the winners and the... No. It's going to be a heyday of vitriol one way or the other. There's going to be scorn. There's going to be mockery. There's going to be name-calling. What about us? It is more difficult when we are politically opposed to the leader. And so I'm particularly preaching to the people who will be the most disappointed after Tuesday. And maybe that's all of us. You know, somebody said, I wonder who's going to win this Tuesday. And somebody said, I don't know, but America will lose. Maybe that's right. But it's easy when the guy who's up there is doing the things we want him to do to say good things about him. Ezra chapter 1 and verse 1, we see Cyrus fulfilling the prophecy that Isaiah made about him. And he's saying such wonderful and glowing things. He's not just like grudgingly sending Israel back when you read that to go rebuild the temple. It's like he is like very pro-Israel and pro-rebuilding the temple. And so it's just kind of overwhelming support that he gives to them. So it would be real easy to say, man, Cyrus, 2 thumbs up. But what about when we think that the guy is just completely at odds with us? When he is the enemy of our state? When he is even maybe our personal enemy? In 2 Samuel chapter 1, David hears of the destruction of Saul and his son Jonathan. And Jonathan deserves the kind of song that David would sing here. Deserves all the praise that David would heap upon him. What about Saul? He says of Saul in verse 19 of them both, your beauty, O Israel, is slain in your high places. How the mighty have fallen. He says of Saul in verse 21, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. He says in verse 22, the sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan, he says in verse 23, beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death they were not parted. And then verse 24, O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. Do you think you can find something nice to say about the political opponent this week? Now you might be thinking, well, there is nothing. Let me just tell you. Whoever that is, he's not coming after you trying to kill you. He doesn't think that you, as an individual, are the one man that he has to hunt down and kill to get out of his way so that he can be successful. Now you might say, I'm going to have to get creative. Okay, I think David had to get creative here. Because frankly, there's not a whole lot of nice things to say about Saul. But he finds some things. What about Daniel? In Daniel chapter 4. As he's standing before Nebuchadnezzar, who came in and laid waste to the capital city of Daniel's home and the temple that represented the very presence of God. And Daniel stands before this man who is a tyrant. And Nebuchadnezzar tells him of the dream that he's had with this tree and what happens to the tree and it being cut down and so forth. It says in verse 19, then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was appalled for a while at his thoughts, as his thoughts alarmed him. The king responded and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. Belteshazzar replied, my lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your adversaries. Daniel was able to honor the conqueror of his nation, such that he even said, I don't want to see harm come to you. The vitriol has gotten such that in both directions, people are constantly talking about the sorts of things that they would like to happen to the other guy. I don't want any part of that. I want the best possible things to happen for either one of these men. I want their eyes to be opened like Nebuchadnezzar, but I don't even want them to have to go through what Nebuchadnezzar goes through to get there. That's what Daniel said. This is going to be the best for Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel says, I don't like to even think about this. Not even for this guy. He could be sitting there going, we'll see what happens now. But then, when the governments do flip, and Nebuchadnezzar and his son, they're no longer in power, and Daniel's enjoyed prosperity there, then the new guys come in, and lo and behold, Daniel honors that king. And he shows him regard, such that Darius respects him as well. None of this means that we ignore realities, that we ignore real problems. I'm not saying everything's sunshine and rainbows and we can just talk nice and all the bad will go away. Luke chapter 13 and verse 32, of course, is a passage that gets brought up so often that Jesus said of Herod, go tell that fox. I don't think he meant that as a compliment. Behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today, and tomorrow and the third day I reach my goal. Jesus described leaders as they were. The prophets surely did. And yet, I think that we take those exceptional moments and we act like Jesus went around cursing the king everywhere he went. When in fact, Jesus just has very little to say about them. I see a lot of people saying all over social media, it's time that Christians stood up and spoke out against the oppressive forces at work or against the wickedness of this party or that party. And I'm like, where? Show me the campaign. Again, Jesus, when he is approached, says, he's Caesar. Give him his money. What do I got to do with that? I got more important business. And so people want us to say something, to call them out. I'm fine. I'm fine with saying, I think that this is wickedness. But really, I think what we ought to be doing more of is detaching the party and just saying, this is wicked regardless of who does it, regardless of who says it. It is wicked. And stop making it such a personal thing. It's not wicked because this, and that's what really ought to expose us. When we only call it wickedness when this guy does it. In 2012, there was a poll among conservative voters or Republican voters. I don't remember which term they use. How important is personal character in the leading of a country? 70% said it is fundamentally important. In 2016, they ran that same poll, and the numbers had switched, and only 30% said it is fundamentally important. Well, you know why. Because they couldn't defend the character of the guy that they were voting for. Now, I'm not saying that therefore it's wrong to vote for that guy. But it's wrong for us to be so hypocritical and switch our minds and our notions and say, this is wrong for this guy, but not for my guy. I honor the king, whoever he is. And I don't put my hope and my trust in him. This honor is separate and apart, actually, from his character. It's not a matter of what he deserves. It's a matter of what God has called me to give. And so that's what I want to keep in mind this week, no matter what happens, and especially if things don't go the way that I want them to, which in some ways is a certainty. And so remember to honor those in authority. I hope that the election is not the most impactful thing in your life this week. I hope that you will commit to growing closer to God, that at the end of this week, you will be more thoughtful and closer to God than you were at the beginning of the week, and you won't let what's happening in this world get in the way of that. That you will seek to honor more and draw nearer to your brethren than you were at the beginning of this week. That you will not use whatever you're going to do this week with the elections of men as a way to divide you and those that you should have the most important things in common with. It is not a hyperbole, though, to say that you could make the most important decision of your life this very morning. You know, all that, this is the most important election, it's the most critical, everything hinges on this. If you're not a Christian this morning, you could make a decision upon which eternity for you truly does hinge. And how small that makes Tuesday look. You could make a decision that would separate you from the consequences. You know, I was looking at, I think Brother Dory Moyer wrote an article, and I think it's the one I shared this morning, that if this world is all there is, then it makes sense that people get so worked up and hang their life on what happens this week. But if there's something else, then boy, it just starts to get looking pretty small. I'm not saying it has no consequences, but they don't compare to these consequences. That's not overstatement. I know it is the thing that a preacher says every week. It's true every week. Every time someone gives their life to God, they have truly made the most important decision of their lives. Would you make that decision this morning and be impacted in that way? If there's any way that we can help you respond to that invitation, won't you come while we stand?